Morning, everyone. I'm here again. This is Phyllis Carey. I'm going to be making a quick recipe for you this morning. I'm having a friend dropping by in a little while, and I thought I'd make some scones when she comes by. We're going to sit outside and catch up. We haven't seen each other for about 6 or 8 months, maybe even longer. This is a friend of mine from high school, and we've been going to concerts and traveling together over the last 10 years, so it's going to be fun to catch up a little bit. So today I'm going to make some blueberry scones, some blueberry orange scones, adding a little bit of orange zest. So basically with baking like this, it's always best to get everything ready ahead of time, get your oven preheated. This particular recipe cooks at 400 degrees. Scones are something that have so many variations. You can do different flavors, you can do all sorts of things. The traditional original ones were just plain with a few currants, maybe some sultanas, they call them, raisins or golden raisins in there. But nowadays we jazz it up all the time. I think blueberry scones are one of my favorites, but as we get a little further into October, pumpkin scones are very, very popular, and they're some of my favorites as well. I love pumpkin everything. So today we're going to do blueberry orange, as I mentioned. And first of all, I have flour. I'm going to make a smaller recipe because there's only 2 of us, and I don't really need 12 tiny scones or 6 large scones that this recipe makes. So I'm going to do a half of a recipe. So the recipe, by the way, you'll be able to find on my website later on today or tomorrow. And first of all, I start out with 1 cup of flour. Then we're going to add to that our leavening. So I have baking powder. It's about 2 teaspoons of baking powder for this. So I have 1 in here. And some salt. It's about a teaspoon of salt. So I'm using a half teaspoon. Then we're going to also add some sugar. Scones are very much like biscuits, only they're almost always made with butter. And so they're very rich. And they're usually a little bit sweet, but I do have lots of savory scone recipes as well. So I'm going to add a little bit of sugar. So our dry ingredients are in here. We're just going to whisk those together. And then we need to add the fat. And of course, as I mentioned, butter. I use unsalted butter so that I get a really buttery flavor. I can add my own salt to it. And a trick that I've learned recently is instead of just chopping up the butter and rubbing it in, is to actually grate it while it's very frozen. So I'm going to grab a stick of butter straight out of the freezer here. And we're going to grate it. What this does is give you very small little chips of butter, so it makes it a whole lot easier to mix it in, a lot faster. You can almost just stir the butter chips in. So it's frozen solid. You want the big side of your grater, and you're going to grate. So the full recipe calls for a whole stick of butter, half a cup. So my recipe is a quarter of a cup, or half a stick of butter. And you notice I just took it out of the freezer to do this. You don't want to do it ahead of time and let that butter soften, partially because your hand is warm and it's also going to start to melt this butter. So it seems like it's a little hard, but the better butter you have, the softer it will be. If all you have is salted butter, just cut the salt down in the recipe and this will also work as well. Great, great, great. We're almost there. And then we're going to toss that into the dough, and we're going to work it in. You can either work it in with your fingers, with a fork. You can try just stirring it in when it's grated like this. That seems to work fairly well. Or, okay, I think we're just about there. A couple more. And of course you could grate this, but it's a lot easier if I need a half a stick to go ahead and just hold on to the whole stick. So here are our little butter shavings. They look so cute. And actually a bowl of these on the table would soften really quickly too. And then you'll be able to scoop it onto your scone. So you can actually grate the whole thing and use it then. Although I must admit I do like salted butter when I'm putting them on my scones. All right, so there we go. Quarter of a cup of butter. And where's my mixture? There we go. And then we're going to add that to our flour mixture. It's kind of fun. It's something a little different, and it doesn't take any longer than really chopping up the butter. So to me, it works equally well. I've done this on several recipes, and you'll see it online too. You can actually look up grated butter, and you'll run across lots of biscuit and scone recipes to use this for. So we kind of work that in. Just kind of stirring it in today. I want the butter to warm up a little bit so that it mixes in, but I don't want it to mix in too much because that's going to give me the flakiness. I find I get a little bit more flakiness with this. Try when you're working with scones not to overwork them. No kneading hard, just we'll bring it all together, but no more than that. Today I mentioned we're going to do orange flavor, so I'm going to add a little bit of orange rind or orange zest. I want about a teaspoon for my recipe or 2 teaspoons for a larger recipe. And I'm just dragging my zester over the outside of the orange. This is so that you can actually measure it more accurately. The orange will end up in here. You can measure it from there, or you can just eyeball it. Now, orange zest is a lot wetter than lemon zest. You can do this with lemon, by the way, too. Lemon and blueberries are great together as well. So I find that when I'm doing an orange, you probably get 2 teaspoons out of one good size orange. But you won't get much more, where I can get a tablespoon out of a smaller lemon. So just be aware that you may find you don't get much, and it's very wet. So I use a little bit coarser microplane for this. This is the one that has a slightly larger holes to it. It just makes it work a little bit more easily. All right, so now we have our dry ingredients, so let's move on to our wet ingredients. Scones are, as I mentioned, rich. They're usually made with whipping cream, or they're made with buttermilk, because both of those are very thick in texture and give you a really good texture to your scones. Today I'm using whipping cream, and I'm going to whisk into that an egg. Some scones have eggs, some scones don't have any eggs. I find that eggs give it a cakey, fluffier texture to them. They're not quite so heavy, but again, it doesn't really matter, whichever you prefer. Now when we get our wet mixture in there, we want to not overmix, but we need to combine everything really well. Ideally, you'll have the egg and the cream out at room temperature, so if you can take them out as you begin prepping everything, they'll warm up a little bit better, and then they will mix in a little bit more evenly. All right, cream and egg. And again, you're going to find scones that are formed the way these are today. You're going to find drop scones, which means the batter is a little bit wetter. All you have to do is blop it out on your cookie sheet and bake them. That's a great way to do it too, especially when you're in a hurry. Stir this all around. And the more you can do with a spatula in the bowl, the less chance you are of overworking it. They may be a little moist. They may be a little dry. You can kind of adjust that by adding a little bit more flour to your board when you need it. When you pull them out before you cut them, you can adjust by adding a couple drops of whipping cream to it if you need to. All right, we're just about there. If it seems a little bit wet at all, be sure that you do put some extra flour down on your work area. That way it'll be absorbed. Don't use too much because you don't really know yet. And before we turn it out, the last thing we want to do is to add our blueberries or diced up apricots or raisins or dried cranberries, chocolate chips, chopped nuts, whatever you like. So it's a cup to a cup and a half of berries. And the hardest part about adding the berries when they're fresh like this is, of course, they want to get all mashed in there. So be careful that you don't mash the blueberries. You're going to have purple dough. It's the reason I don't like to use frozen berries for this. Dried blueberries would be great. Dried cranberries are great, or cherries. Any of that is fine. But the fresh berries, you need to be really careful with them. If you decide to use fresh cranberries, for instance, they're very tart, so you're going to need a lot more sugar in the recipe. All right, so let's turn our dough out. This is always the fun part. Okay. So now we need to form this into our scones. And it's a fairly sticky dough today. It's usually fairly rough too. So don't expect it to be a firm, dry, smooth dough. It's not like that at all. It's not like we're going to roll it out like pie crust. We are simply going to pat it out. It'll all come together very nicely into a circle. And if I was doing a full recipe, I would cut it in half, and I'd be able to make 12 of these small scones, or I would just make one larger circle and cut it into 6 and have 6 large scones. But I'll tell you, it's almost better to make the smaller ones, and then if somebody really wants to, they can have 2. Make sure your dough is no thinner than an inch, and you can even get a ruler out to measure it. Grab it out of the towel here. Because if it's too thin, these are not going to be that light, airy texture that we love so much for scones. All right, that's it. Now we need to cut them. A nice sharp knife. And again, I'm cutting it into 6. And they're in pie wedges, hopefully about the same size. The beauty of scones is they don't have to be perfect. We love to have them a little rough. These triangles are going to be transferred to a parchment-lined baking sheet back here that I have. And these, again, are fairly soft doughed ones, so you may need to reform a little bit. Leave space between them. If I do a full batch and I do 12, I actually do 2 cookie sheets for this. 6 fit on here perfectly. You get any more on here, and sometimes they're just too crowded. I have not very many blueberries in this, so I'm stealing that one and popping it in there. And 2 more to our cookie sheet. We're not quite done yet. They're not quite ready to pop into the oven yet, but almost. So the next thing we need to do is to brush them with a little bit more cream. And the beauty of doing this is we're going to get really nice shiny top to it. And so we're going to take a little bit more of that cream. And if you use buttermilk, buttermilk's fine on the top too. It doesn't matter. This is something that's great to do with leftover buttermilk. Okay. You don't know what to do with it. Make some scones. Throw them in the freezer because these freeze like a dream. All right, so here's our scones. You can see they're fairly rough in shape, but they're basically little wedges, little triangles. And we're going to dab some butter on top. Excuse me, butter. We're going to dab some whipping cream on top. We don't want it oozing down the sides, just on top. Again, this is going to make a nice crust on the surface, and it's going to help them brown really well as giving them the crust. If you needed to stick something on the top, you wanted a bunch of cheese or you wanted nuts or something on the top of it, you really wanted to stick it, you would brush it with egg instead because the cream isn't going to do anything. And the last thing we're going to do to encourage a crispy, crusty top is to sprinkle with a little bit of sugar. Now, this is sanding sugar. It's a very coarse sugar. I buy mine online and just have a bunch of it. It's white. For the holidays, you can pick out just the same thing you decorate cookies with, except usually those are in colors. So if you happen to have a colored one, you could add that as well. Do note I have parchment. Okay, 1 is so the scones don't stick. We don't want the scones to stick to the tray. And 2, I miss with the sugar all the time. So the sugar now gets onto the parchment and it won't burn up onto the tray and stick to the tray and all that sort of thing. So that's good. All right, that's it. These are now our blueberry orange scones, and they're going to go into the oven and bake for anywhere from 18 to 22 minutes, 400 degrees. So we'll be back when these are done, and I'll show you the final result. I'm back with the finished scones. I just want to show you how they look and how they plate up beautifully when you're ready to eat them. By the way, these scones, you can make them early and reheat them. You can freeze them. They freeze beautifully. The best way to reheat a scone, though, is wrapped in foil and then set it on a cookie sheet. Even if you put it in the toaster oven, it keeps it from drying out. These are very, very soft scones. They're more cakey, as I mentioned, because of the addition of the egg. So not that tall, crusty variety, but they are so good and they just melt in your mouth. We're serving it today with, as I mentioned, butter. I'm also using one of my favorite jam products. This is from Charter Oak. You can find them online. It's a local purveyor here in Carlsbad, and it's delicious. This is her plum and raspberry preserves, but I love all of her products, and she makes excellent lemon curd too if you don't feel in the mood to make it yourself. So we've just created a little plate for each person. We have our scone, some fresh butter, and this is, by the way, the Irish butter that's so creamy and wonderful, and then some of the preserves so they can help themselves. Just want you to see what these look like. They're super soft, really filled with fresh blueberries. They still have that nice, sweet, crunchy edge to them, which is just perfect. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy your scones. So good. Bye-bye.